So I'm Dave Brain. My last name really is Brain, so you should please call me Dave, because Dr. Brain or Professor Brain sounds really spooky, and so we'll just yeah, so maybe it was Dr. Brain and Laura Aurora, or yeah, okay.
Do you ever write papers where you form sentences with last names? Because you could totally do that.
No.
And you and I should never publish a paper.
That's right. I am really hoping at some point in my career to discover a new kind of plasma wave, and then everyone can call them brain waves. And but so far, no luck.
We just hired a grad student named Pinky.
So MAVEN has been a big part of my life and my career for the past 10 years or so. Maybe not this big relative to the planet Mars. This is not actually to scale. But I want to tell you a little bit about how it's affected me, the measurements that we're getting that I'm so happy to have after a year, after a decade of waiting, and multiple children, and some of the reasons that I think MAVEN should excite anyone that you would happen to run into on the street or any place. But we're going to go sometimes in more detail into what Bruce said, sometimes in different directions, but I'm happy to go any direction that you would like to as we talk. One last thing, the Martian atmosphere is not purple, but in this cartoon, the Martian atmosphere is escaping from the planet. Okay, so this is my one and only sort of personal slide. I decided if Bruce got to tell stories last night for an hour, I get to tell them right now for about a minute and a half, and that seems proportionally appropriate. But I've been working on it since probably several months after Bruce's first conversation with Bob Lynn and Janet Lumen here at Berkeley. And it's the first mission that I've been involved with from the start. As a graduate student, I joined the Mars Global Surveyor mission right as it was arriving at Mars, shortly after it arrived at Mars. I've been involved in a few other missions, but hadn't gotten yet to be there from sort of the ground floor to help see how some of the decisions are made and even participate in some of those. So it's been a great thrill for me to be involved. And two of the biggest thrills are in the top two pictures up here. The one on the top left is as close as I ever got to the spacecraft, and I'm frankly a little shocked that the engineers even let me that close to the spacecraft. And you notice that there's a glass retaining wall there. They told us that that was to keep the spacecraft clean, but I know better. That's actually a scientist retaining wall. And because when you let the scientists that close, they would walk up to the spacecraft and start poking things. And this is at Lockheed Martin. And when a spacecraft is finished at Lockheed Martin, the Lockheed employees are able to go view the spacecraft in this fashion. And Bruce did a really great job advocating for all MAVEN team members to be able to come and look at the spacecraft before it was bottled up and sent to the Cape. Lockheed Martin employees are allowed to bring family members, and Bruce tried for outsiders as well, but because of security reasons on the Lockheed Martin campus, only the people who had worked on the mission could come. So 3 of us drove down to view the spacecraft, and when we got to see it, they were taking your picture in front of the spacecraft. And people who had gone down in groups were all standing up there in groups together. Some of them did Charlie's Angels poses and things like that and had their arms around each other. My group of friends was kind of oblivious, so we all just went up one at a time and had our picture taken in front of the spacecraft. So you can't read this text down here that says MAVEN Friends and Family Night. So there I am at MAVEN Friends and Family Night, looking like I have neither. But I'm still grinning from ear to ear because I get to see the spacecraft. And then launch was another big moment as well, and my whole family and everyone's whole family went down to the Cape for the launch, and we're out on the causeway, and Bruce, actually Mary, Bruce's spouse, is about here. 30 yards away from us, leading cheers and chants and getting the crowd all riled up and clapping and cheering. And you know, it was a big moment when the spacecraft launches that you've been working on, maybe not touching things, but been involved with for so long. And you can see some of the cloud cover in the background, so it wasn't a perfectly clear day. So MAVEN launched and everyone cheered, and then the spacecraft disappeared behind a cloud, and everyone got quiet. And then it reappeared in a hole in the clouds, and everyone cheered again. And I turned to my wife and I said, I still might get tenure because the launch appeared to be successful at that point. And then my daughter, who was 6 at the time, bless her heart, came up and gave me the biggest hug you can ever imagine, a melt-your-heart hug. And she looked at me and she said, Daddy, now what will you work on? So it had been gone 30 seconds, and she's already asking where my next proposal is. But, you know, in her eyes, I can't work on it anymore. It's gone. And so it made perfect sense. And one of the great things about working with spacecraft data or data from any mission is getting to play with these data that are brand new. Sometimes your eyes are the first eyes that have ever been laid on these data, which is an absolute high. It's a thrill. And especially with a new mission, fairly often you're the first person in the history of humanity to understand some new tidbit about how the universe works or how other planets work. And it's an incredible thrill when other people also care about that tidbit. But for me, just knowing that I'm the first person to understand something is really a great and kind of odd feeling. And so this is one thing I love about being involved in spacecraft missions. They're just really a lot of fun, and I'm incredibly happy with my career choice right now. I love what I do. I would pay to get to do what I do, and Bruce did not hear that right then. But they are a lot of fun, but that's not why they get funded. Any spacecraft mission has to be asking questions that are of interest to others, that have been deemed appropriate and important, and that are worth an investment of taxpayer money to find the answers. And so it was a competitive thing for us. We were really happy to get selected. And hopefully we're doing good things. I believe we're doing good things with the money that we've been given. And at the end, I'll come back to how this might relate to some other things. Okay. The Martian atmosphere today, Bruce described it briefly. I'm going to do it with pictures. There are 3 things that you should understand about the Martian atmosphere, and I'm sure you already do. It's cold. On the warmest of summer days, it gets up above freezing. The average temperature on Mars is about 50, 53, 54, 55 degrees Celsius below zero. The coldest temperatures are 150 below zero Celsius. It's a cold place, but it gets up to freezing. If you were an astronaut walking around on the surface, you could live with that. You'd have a little problem with toxic. And I debated on images here between this more conventional one or this one for the younger folk, right here, back and forth. And so I'm gonna go back to that one, right there. 95.
Sorry, Dave, I'm old. Who was that?
Britney Spears, who I don't even know if Toxic is the name of the song or the album. Is it the song? Okay. Because I'm a little bit old. 95% carbon dioxide, that is a problem if you're an astronaut walking around on the surface. And then thin, the atmosphere is 7 millibars, 7 1,000ths the thickness of Earth's atmosphere. Earth's atmosphere is 1 bar because scientists are lazy. And defined 1 bar, actually it's 1.015 bars, but they found a unit that is approximately 1 for Earth's atmospheric thickness. So the atmospheric thickness of Mars is about 1/2 of 1% the thickness of Earth's atmosphere. That's really bad. It's like walking around up in the stratosphere, which is maybe not a good thing to do if you want to live. But the thin and the cold also combine together to make liquid water not a happy substance on the surface of the planet. Liquid water can exist there for a few minutes or a few hours in certain specific regions at certain specific times of year. But in general, the thin atmosphere makes it so that water doesn't like to be a liquid at the surface. And so I haven't gone into all the evidence we have for the fact that liquid water has helped shape the surface of Mars and has heavily influenced the surface of Mars. But liquid water has spent considerable amounts of time at the surface. And it's something that doesn't like to be there today. Those two statements combined together strongly suggests that the atmosphere has changed in important ways over time. And so this is really the big question that MAVEN is getting at. And of course, liquid water being happy or unhappy on the surface is also tied to habitability and life as we know it on Earth. And so this is the underlying justification for MAVEN that Bruce went through at the beginning of his talk. And if liquid water was happy on the surface in the past, and the atmosphere was different, what caused the atmosphere to change? For liquid water to be happy, the atmosphere needs to have been thicker. There needs to have been more greenhouse warming. At least this is one idea that the scientific community is entertaining, an idea that we want to test. And so the question you can ask is, where did the atmosphere go? Bruce also answered this question, and I am again going to answer it with pictures, but I'm going to use a flow chart so that we're all on the same page and we understand all of the different processes that can act on the atmosphere. And so there we are, we're done. That's it. It's a 2-arrow flow chart. If you are an atmospheric particle and you do not go up or you do not go down, congratulations, you are still an atmospheric particle. So my mother is so proud when I show this diagram because I only work on this arrow right here. That's my entire career, are the ups, and that's MAVEN's entire job. But more seriously, the scientific community collectively doesn't know how large to draw these arrows on the diagram at present. How important are the processes? They don't know how large these arrows should have been through time, and they don't know how large they should be relative to each other. And it would be too much to ask one mission to resolve this entire 2-arrow diagram. But MAVEN is going to be constraining this arrow right here in the present epoch and through time, through the various instruments and measurements that we have. Okay, so what can take a particle and move it to space? There are actually lots of different processes. I'm being glib, of course. And this arrow has about maybe six or seven different mechanisms that all contribute to removing particles away to space. Okay, this diagram, actually I don't know if you are aware of this, Bruce, but Jasper Hallekas and I together made this diagram for the MAVEN proposal. And this is, I think, version 19 of this diagram. And we went back and forth trying to make it look simple but have it be correct. And we're still not happy with the diagram. But it does capture everything that MAVEN is trying to measure. And it's a lot. But it can be divided into 3 things. Drivers, the things that deposit energy in the system, and there's several of them. These are the things that push the system that can cause particles to escape. These are basically the knobs on the radio or on the oven, and they have different settings, and there are lots of them. And then the system itself is the Martian atmosphere, which are blue and red on the diagram. Blue standing for neutral particles, which we're embedded in right now. Red standing for charged particles, particles that have lost an electron and therefore are subject to magnetic and electric fields. At the top of the Martian, you have to excuse me, I had a cold a week ago, and every time I get a cold, it's followed by a cough, and so I have a cough right now. And it's gonna get to be as annoying for you as it is for me in another 3 or 4 minutes. So we want to measure the knobs, we want to measure the upper atmospheric particles, because this is the soup, the swimming pool from which particles can escape to space. And then we want to measure all of these different arrows, all the different ways that atmospheric particles can leave the planet. So you need a fair number of instruments to be able to do that. And this is one thing that has allowed us to build on what past missions have done, is make sure that we have the instruments that can measure all of these things simultaneously. Because you want to know how the knobs on the oven are set, you want to know what's happening in the pot, and you want to know how much steam is escaping from the pot to space, all at the same time. If you measure just one part of that problem, then connecting things becomes more difficult, and extrapolating back in time becomes impossible. Okay, so what causes the ups? What are the drivers? You can put those into 4 categories, and they had never been measured all at the same time at Mars before MAVEN arrived. And so there are 4 different ways, excuse me, and they're supposed to do snazzy things even. Oh, it's loading. Okay. Photons are sunlight, but not so much visible light. For the top part of the atmosphere, it's ultraviolet light, extreme ultraviolet light, that is absorbed by the particles there and can make them get all excited and possibly escape. And in addition to the sunlight going into the atmosphere, there's the solar wind, this stream of plasma. And plasma just means positively charged and negatively charged particles, protons and electrons, screaming away from the sun at 400 kilometers per second. And the solar wind goes screaming towards all bodies in the solar system, and those bodies react differently depending upon their characteristics. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple slides. The magnetic field, however, these charged particles, as they're streaming away from the sun, carry a magnetic field with them. And that magnetic field gets carried throughout the solar system. This is maybe a much larger scale than you're expecting when you look at this diagram. The sun's at the center, Earth is here, Mars is here, Venus is over here, and these are magnetic field lines predicted by a model that are threading throughout the solar system. All the planets are embedded in this solar magnetic field. Red are magnetic field lines pointed away from the sun. Blue are magnetic field lines toward the sun. There's no such thing as a magnetic monopole in nature. So for every away field line, there has to be a toward field line to compensate. And so roughly half of the field is away, roughly half of the field is toward, and the sun is spinning once a month or so. And so the magnetic field that all the different planets experience changes not just because the sun is changing, but also because the sun is rotating and they're seeing different parts of the magnetic field. And so we need to measure that as well.
What is the darker blue like?
It's just where the field lines kind of converge. There's some sort of front here. It could actually be an expanding solar storm magnetic field, a coronal mass ejection or something like that. I'm not sure for this diagram. And then finally, I just mentioned solar storms, and we'll talk more about that near the end, but they're not just solar wind particles at 400 kilometers per second, which is pretty fast, but they're solar wind particles moving at near relativistic speeds. They're emitted from flares on the sun, and they're also emitted when, let's just pretend that this is a solar storm shock front, they're also produced in these shock fronts and move in either direction away from the shock front. So if you're at a planet, you could be hit by solar energetic particles coming from flares or coming from a passing shock. And I do want to show at least that if it plays. Okay. There you go. So this is SOHO down here, which is observing the sun and the stellar atmosphere. But there was a solar storm here, and all this fuzz that you see are the solar energetic particles hitting the hydrogen imager on the SOHO spacecraft. So all these things sort of add up to be space weather. Okay, we've never had measurements of these at Mars all at the same time, and this is important. This is determining what the boundary conditions are for the system, what the initial conditions are. And so all four of these things we're measuring. I haven't put solar energetic particles on this figure, but you saw them in Bruce's presentation. But here are at least 3 of the 4 types of drivers all being measured by MAVEN. Photons, extreme ultraviolet light, and our EUV instrument has 3 different channels, so we can look at EUV light in 3 different wavelength ranges, and I just picked one here. And you can see several things. One, you can see the solar rotation period of about a month, as the intensity of light is modulated by solar rotation, sometimes brighter, sometimes dimmer. Ooh, I'm hungry apparently. You can also see solar flares. And when you look at all 3 channels together, the individual important flares stand out a little more. Since I've only picked one, I know that this one was a studied solar flare, and that this one was one of interest for people as well. And so these are some of the inputs. The quiet time influence, which has variability on long time scales, and then the short time scale variability, which can be larger amplitude as well. And so you had asked a question before about what dominates, and the answer is we don't know. And An analogy that I like to use that is probably getting overused at this point is if you were to ask people standing on a beach in Indonesia what's more important for shaping their shoreline, whether it's the everyday motion in and out of the waves with the tides, or it's the tsunamis, they would have an opinion. And right now at Mars, it could be either one. It could be the tsunamis that really govern what happens to the atmosphere and how it gets stripped away, or it could be sort of the everyday energy that it's exposed to. So we'd like to understand the answer to that question today, but we have to acknowledge that the answer to that question may have been different a long time ago. We've also measured the solar wind with the SWIA instrument, SWIA, Solar Wind Ion Analyzer. And SWIA, by measuring the energy and direction of particles encountering the spacecraft, can back out what the density and the velocity of those particles are as a function of time in months. And you can see that there are low density and high density periods and high velocity and low velocity periods, including over here a relatively high velocity time period. But when you combine these together, you can come up with pressure. The pressure of the solar wind as it's pushing on the Martian atmosphere. And pressure, we think, is an important driver for the system. And you can see during that coronal mass ejection event, the solar storm event that Bruce talked about, the pressure got to be very high, the highest we've observed in the mission so far. The third one is magnetic field, the magnetic field carried by the solar wind. We measure its strength, and it got to be very strong during that solar storm period. But we also measure its direction. And you can denote a direction by 3 different components of the magnetic field. And so we can plot all 3 on the same diagram and see how strong the field was and which way it was pointing, out or in, or bent over to the side, or very radial from the sun. Okay, so those are the drivers to the system. What about the system itself? How are we measuring that? And I'm a plasma guy. And I know that is so exciting to everyone that I ever meet. And I completely agree with you about how exciting plasma is. And so I've selected to talk primarily about plasma here, acknowledging your excitement about the topic. And also knowing that Paul is going to talk more about the atmospheric soup in his presentation as well. So I'm going to focus on plasma. So we've talked about, we've used the word magnetosphere, and we've talked about induced magnetospheres, and I'm just going to take you quickly through what that is for Mars. And I can't take you through what that is. I'm not capable. Someone else might be capable, but I'm not capable of doing that without also showing a figure of Earth next. But let's start with Mars. Mars doesn't have a big global magnetic field driven in the interior of the planet through dynamo motion. It's basically because Mars lost enough energy to sustain that dynamo motion. Mars is a smaller baked potato than Earth. They both came out of the oven at the same time. Mars cooled off more quickly and therefore can't create this big magnetosphere that Earth still has. Therefore, the solar wind is not deflected by a big planetary magnetic field. Here it is for Earth. The solar wind comes in. There's a big, strong magnetic field generated in the interior. It creates this magnetic configuration that if you were to close your eyes and I were to say, picture Earth's magnetic field, you'd picture something like this. The solar wind gets deflected around the planet and Earth's atmosphere is well protected. At Mars, when you take all this stuff away, the solar wind can get much closer to the atmosphere, and it can intermingle with atmospheric particles that extend very far from the planet. And you get this complicated plasma interaction that, if you like plasma physics, and is really fun to study because all sorts of crazy things happen. The solar wind is still deflected around the planet, and it's deflected around the planet by the fact that Mars has an atmosphere, and the atmosphere becomes ionized. Those ions carry current, and the current is able to deflect the magnetic fields around by generating a magnetic field. So we call this an induced magnetosphere. But you can just, the main point is the solar wind intermingles with the top layers of the atmosphere and might be able to strip, and definitely is able to strip, blobs of charged particles away from the planet.
Does that boundary essentially in the ionosphere on the day side?
This one here?
The induced magnetosphere boundary.
Yeah, so I call this boundary Voldemort because it is the boundary that shall not be named. There are about 15 different names for this boundary in the literature, but I'm going with induced magnetosphere boundary. And yes, this boundary is intermingled with the upper layers of the ionosphere and the exosphere, if you're familiar with different atmospheric regions. Exosphere are neutral particles that don't collide very often. Ionosphere are charged particles. And those two regions of the atmosphere are not distinct from each other. They're intermingled with each other. And this boundary between the solar wind and the atmosphere occurs down in that region, in that soup of particles. Mars is additionally really exciting because even though it doesn't have a global magnetic field, there are these crustal magnetic fields carried in the outer regions of the crust. And I said earlier one of my claims to fame is that Bruce was on my thesis committee. Another one of my claims to fame, I'm not sure if you know this, but the very first time I was ever asked about my work by someone wanting to write about it, it was by Kelly Beatty when I was a grad student about the crustal magnetic fields. So I'm not going to go into those too much today, but I'm going to mention that because it came up, I threw this slide in response to some of the discussion last time. The crustal magnetic fields at Mars are wacky looking. And I could describe exactly what you're looking at, but they're basically whiskers of magnetic field. And reds are away from the planet, blues are toward the planet. But the main point is that the crustal magnetic fields are wacky, and they're strongest in the southern hemisphere. And MAVEN's precessing orbit, Bruce did the dance where we had to turn off our cameras yesterday. MAVEN's precessing orbit is just now getting down to the region of interest above these strong crustal fields. So most of the observations I'll show you today, the crustal fields don't really play a strong role in organizing the results because we're up here in this very exciting region for escape science, but this relatively boring region for crustal fields. Yeah.
So Bruce, maybe this is a question for you. It's part of what I was going to ask. What was the periapse latitude when you started the science mission, and where is it now, and has it been a linear procession?
Is there a diagram?
There is a diagram.
Yeah. Do you have it handy, or would you like me to put it up?
I can pull it up. Yeah, I've been looking at this for far too long. I see a face here. I see a fountain of up magnetic field surrounded by down. And then, yes, and there's a butterfly. If you keep looking, there's a butterfly. We'll come back to it. I'll let Bruce talk to it.
That one shows the geographic latitude and local time of the subspacecraft point from the beginning of the mission all the way through the mission. Over the one-year mission, the precession carries it twice around the planet in local time, and it cycles once through all the latitudes, down then up. During the extended mission, we'll do the same thing again. Do you have it in solar coordinates as well? This is the same thing, but relative to the latitude and longitude as if the sun was at 0, 0. So it gives you local time and latitude relative to the sun. Because Mars is tilted relative to the sun, it's not the same as the previous chart. This is the one that I think in terms of because everything relative to the sun is what's important, but the previous one is what it looks like relative to the planet.
So here we are now.
That also gets to the answer to the question you were addressing earlier. Why is a one Earth year mission appealing? And here you get the coverage.
Yeah.
In one.
Exactly. If you go back to the other one, Dave. So we started at a sub-spacecraft geographic latitude of around, I'm looking for the start of the science mission. It was mid-November, right there, 60 degrees. But that was when, relative to the sun, we were farther north. The geographic latitudes vary between plus and minus 75 degrees, actually 76.2, because that's the inclination of the orbit relative to the polar axis.
Are the blue lozenges deep dips?
Yes.
maybe not as executed, right?
As originally planned.
Right.
So for example, the one in the very upper right, we elected to postpone until the extended mission because we weren't quite ready to do it. We've done the second and third ones, which we're calling the first and second ones. I love the nomenclature. As soon as we come out from solar conjunction, which is next week, we start preparation for the third one, or the fourth one, depending on how you count. The one that starts on a little bit later than shown there. We pushed it back so we have some observations before we begin, and we start the walk-in on July 7th.
Thank you.
Okay, so since we're talking about response of the system to these drivers, I want to take one chart that Bruce had that he showed and break that apart into 4 separate charts. And so with our solar wind ion instrument, we can measure the ions that are encountering Mars that have come from the sun towards the planet. And here's this crazy cylindrical coordinate system that we like to use, where this is the Mars-Sun line, and then this is distance from the Mars-Sun line on the other axis. And so this coordinate system implicitly assumes that everything is cylindrically symmetric around the Mars-Sun line, which is not true when you get down into the details, but for at least understanding to 0th order how the solar wind interacts with the planet, this is okay.
So you've projected everything around into this one point.
Yeah, we basically, it was a 3D thing. We took a fish knife and slit it open on the bottom and then folded it back up like this.
You have a future in modern dance.
Yes.
Okay. See, you keep tempting me to just stop and walk off. Okay. So Bruce showed the magnetospheric structure. Here all the little arrows show the velocity of the plasma as it's going past Mars, and they've all been normalized to whatever the velocity was in the solar wind so that they're all on more or less the same scale. And the colors show you the density of particles around the planet. And these are some of the nominal boundaries. This is the boundary that shall not be named, the induced magnetosphere boundary. This is the bow shock where the solar wind first realizes. But these are just average locations of these boundaries as determined from previous measurements. And just like the shoreline moves up and back with the tides and moves up and back with individual waves, there's all sorts of slop in these boundary locations. So these are measurements just when the solar wind pressure was low, among the lowest we've observed in the mission. So there are a lot of holes in this diagram. Now look what happens when we go, there are going to be 4 pressure steps. So now when we go to mid-low pressure, I'll just go back and forth between those two. First of all, we have more data, but I'm going to do it over here. Look at the outer boundary as we go back and forth. It moves in towards the planet. Okay, and as the solar wind blows harder, the space around Mars influenced by the solar wind shrinks. And we can do it one more time. Now it's a little harder to see in the outer boundary, so for the next one, pay attention to the inner boundary. And it's a little hard to see, but if you look at it long enough, you see that the space, especially behind Mars, is getting filled in a little more. It actually looks much better on my screen. And then we can go to the highest solar wind pressure. Now look at the outer boundary again. And it gets moved in even more. So these 4 steps basically show that as the solar wind pushes harder on the planet, the space around the planet that's influencing how particles move gets compressed around the planet, which is a cool visual confirmation of expectations.
And white is just no data.
White are no data yet, given the coverage that we have. That's right. Okay, so that's one example of response of the system. Now let's go to escape. And I'm basically going to walk through the charts that Bruce showed before on maps of escaping flux and talk a little bit more about how we get those, what the limitations are there, and some of the structure. And so this is just a cartoon for me to say, now I'm going to talk about escape. Now I'm going to talk about escape. Okay. Here's the same cylindrical coordinate diagram. Sun is over here. It's colored according to when MAVEN visited different locations. You'll notice that it is currently June, but this diagram only goes up through mid to late March. The reason for that is that when we're talking about escape and trying to count up escape, we need to know how the knobs were set. And in order to know how the knobs were set, MAVEN has to measure the solar wind. And MAVEN's precessing orbit precessed out of the solar wind in mid-March. Now we have devious methods for figuring out what the solar wind was doing at that time based on MAVEN measurements, but we don't have those methods implemented yet. So I just stopped the diagram at roughly the time that MAVEN stopped visiting the solar wind. Yeah.
There are a lot of other spacecraft that are monitoring the solar wind elsewhere in the solar system. Can
Yes.
you use those to infer what's happening?
We can, and so that's one method, is to extrapolate from what's being measured at Earth, for example. Those extrapolations work well if you're trying to work very coarsely. If you're interested in small time changes, those extrapolations tend not to work well. Another time that they don't work well is when Mars and Earth are on opposite sides of the sun from each other. Yeah. So the idea here is for a first cut at escape is to just count all the ions that are leaving the planet, all the charged particles. It's somebody else's job on MAVEN, by the way, to count all the neutral particles that are escaping from the planet. But I'm a plasma guy and I know how much you love plasma, so we're talking about the ions. And so basically what you want to do is you want to put a big butterfly net around Mars and catch all the butterflies that are trying to escape all the ions. And so you can draw this surface around the planet, a shell. Previous missions have just put a plane behind the planet. But a surface appeals to us because it completely encloses the planet. You're not going to miss any escape when you draw a closed shell. So that's what we're doing. And, and then count all the ions. So Bruce showed this coverage diagram, and I have to apologize. I've been focusing more on the nuts and bolts of the science than I have been on display for these kinds of diagrams. So I want to walk you through the diagram a little bit. This is in a coordinate system MSO, Mars Solar Orbital. It's a coordinate system tied to the sun, not geographically to the planet. I have no idea where Olympus Mons is in here. It's in this latitude band somewhere, all spread out. And we can define a longitude system such that 0, 0 is the subsolar point, the point on Mars closest to the sun. So this line right here at 90 degrees divides day side from night side. And so that's why I've organized it in these weird units. So on the left, you know you're looking at the day side. At the right, you know you're looking at the night side. And in the middle is sort of the lowest latitude with respect to the sun. And the coverage here is incredibly depressing. We don't visit that many regions in the first several months of the mission. But that's okay, because ESCAPE doesn't care about this coordinate system too much. And Bruce talked about this too. So instead, you want to go to this coordinate system, Mars Solar Electric Field, Mars Solar Electric Field, and things get all smeared out in that coordinate system. So let me explain why. I'm sorry, there's going to be more dancing. And if you knew how sorry I was. Okay. The solar wind magnetic field are a bunch of spaghetti noodles. They're flowing towards Mars, which is a big ball of cotton candy. And when you throw the spaghetti noodles towards the ball of cotton candy, they drape around the cotton candy and then slip up and over and then go on their merry way and straighten back out again. Now, a moving electric field creates an electric field. I mean, a moving magnetic field creates an electric field. The electric field, because of scientists in the 17, 18, and 1900s, the electric field has to be perpendicular to both the velocity of the flow and the magnetic field. So in that case, the magnetic field is pointed this direction, and it's moving that direction. Okay, and so the electric field in that case points down towards the floor, which means that escaping ions are going to move up. They're accelerated by a minus V cross B electric field, and they're going to escape upwards in this polar plume type mohawk feature that we'll talk about in a minute. But the magnetic field in the solar wind isn't constrained to always be like this. Sometimes it can be like this, sometimes like this, sometimes like this, sometimes like that. Every time the magnetic field changes its orientation, the electric field does too. And that's important because electric fields accelerate charged particles. And so a charged particle is now going to want to go this way around Mars instead of this way around Mars. So as a spacecraft, if you're right here above Mars, you want to know if you are supposed to be seeing escaping particles or not. And so we rotate into this system where the electric field is up in this direction. And so when you rotate into that system, every individual orbit gets rotated differently because the magnetic field in the solar wind is always changing. And that's why I truncated things in mid-March, and that's why this coverage gets so much better. Did anyone care about that other than me? Okay. Plasma is really cool.
On any given instantaneous orbit, you need to know the magnetic field vector in order to know from the origin from which the particles that you're seeing came from.
Correct. Yes, and it allows you to tell where they came from, where they're going, and if you were even in the right place to see it. Not only that, your instruments don't have perfect fields of view. There has to be some metal on the instrument to hold the thing together, which means there are some places on the instrument that can't see incoming particles. So it's also important for knowing, even if your spacecraft was in the right location, were you looking in the right direction?
On the right-hand plot is 0 also subsolar, and the right-hand plot.
Yes, I'm sorry. 0 is also subsolar in the right-hand plot. Okay.
Does this argue for using more and more carbon fiber in spacecraft years?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Dave?
I'm not sure I even understand it.
Well, so if you're running into problems with the metal in your spacecraft inhibiting your ability to make observations, and carbon fiber in a lot of cases is the strength, that can you improve?
You need physical structure. The instrument has to be made out of something.
Right, and I'm wondering, can you, by using carbon fiber instead of
metals, make this smaller.
Oh, it does?
You're going to get some blockage someplace, but you could maybe, through clever construction, decrease the amounts of places that you can't see. Okay, so Bruce showed these maps before, but I'm breaking them up a little bit. We can make maps in the mission so far of escaping flux. Every place that ions were leaving the planet, escaping the butterfly net, we've colored here. And these are in relative units. And so I just made the bottom number 1, and everything is relative to that. And there are a few things here. Number 1, on the day side, there's relatively little escaping flux, especially right near the center of the day side. And on the night side, there's much more escaping flux. So things that are leaving the butterfly net are predominantly leaving from the night side of the planet. There's some hint, and Dave is going to talk about this much more, so I don't want to steal your thunder here, and this is the wrong plot to make the case anyway. But there's some hint that there's a lot of escaping flux here and not as much here, but you can see we don't really have the coverage to make that case. So Dave is going to make that much differently. The second thing that I'll say is that there's return flux, or planetary particles. By the way, this is not solar wind at all. These are all ions that have a mass of 9 or 10 or above atomic mass units. So this means it's oxygen, O+, O2+, CO2+. These are all particles that came from the Martian atmosphere, represented here. And there are places where particles that came from the Martian atmosphere are moving towards Mars. And so that topic came up in the last talk too. You can be a neutral particle, and you can, sorry, the sun is over there. You can be a neutral particle, and you can wander away from the planet, and you can become ionized. When you become ionized, then the solar wind flow starts governing what you do, and you can turn around and be carried back towards the planet again. So there can be return flux as well. Now, why relative units? There are relative units right now for a few reasons. The most important reason is low energy particles are not included in this map. 25 eV, 25 electron volts and below. The reason they're not included is because the charging of the spacecraft itself influences the energies at which particles come into the spacecraft instruments and can influence their trajectories. we're able to correct for that, but we haven't corrected for it yet. We're still trying to understand fully how the spacecraft is charged up. I think we're at a point right now where the people responsible for understanding the charging are getting very close, and when that's done, then we can incorporate that correction into these maps and extend them over all energies. There are a couple of other corrections that I won't go into that haven't been accommodated here yet, and so using real units basically adds no information to the plot, so I'm trying to avoid that for the time being. Okay. This is out of place. It should have come when I was talking about how ions escape governed by the electric field direction, and some do escape around the side, but you expect more in one direction than others. Okay, the next thing you can do are take those two maps that I just showed and take a difference between them. Where is escape dominating? Where is return flux dominating? Turns out the statistics are still messy, but some general trends emerge. On the day side of the planet, return flux dominates, especially in the center. There's still some hint of escape up near the top, and maybe not much near the bottom, but there's a lot of coverage issues here still. And then on the night side, escape dominates the return flux. Yeah.
So you don't yet have enough polar coverage to know whether the polar, the Mohawk dominates the night side escape? Or do you?
Correct. No, Dave will talk more about the existence of the Mohawk and the fact that in individual events we can see that it's there when we expect it and not there when we don't. In terms of adding it up and figuring out which one is more important, we don't have that information yet.
The previous graphic that you showed, which I guess is a model of escape,
Yes.
showed a lot of flux going out through the pole.
Yeah, this model, which was created by one of our team members, maybe even before he became involved in MAVEN, I can't quite remember. This model and this publication suggests that the flux in the Mohawk and the polar plume is significant, is important relative to what's coming down the tail. And this is noteworthy because previous spacecraft haven't really reported measuring this or the existence of this Mohawk before. And there are a couple of reasons for that I think Dave may go into as well.
What's the direction of motion on that?
From the planet up.
No, the planet's motion.
The planet itself is hard because we've rotated into these electric field coordinates. So the electric field points this way. But we have no idea. Assuming that the magnetic field was, in the Mars orbital plane and pointed towards the dusk side of the planet, then that would mean that you're looking at the dawn side of the planet right here. I can't believe I did that in real time. It might even have been right. Who knows?
The flux maps, the escaping flux that Mars Express came up with and that you came up with on that very first orbit where you had the big picture. Is there any evidence for enhanced polar escape?
The very first picture that Bruce showed that were 3 panels, the big difference there is that those are all neutral particles. Okay, and I'm plasma. The neutral particles don't care so much about the solar wind. Yeah. Okay, how am I doing on time, Tom and Laura? Because this was the bulk of what I had to say, but if there's time left, I'll go into the solar storm event for a couple slides and then do my last one.
That's fine. We were scheduled to start discussion at noon.
Okay. I'm going to shoot for 10 after. Is that okay? Yes.
Is any of this giving us any better understanding of the comet hypothesis for water on Earth or anything? Is anything going to help us to maybe refine understanding of that?
Do you want to take that, Bruce? Or is what MAVEN's measuring going to provide insight into the delivery of water to the planet in the first place, whether it was born there or comets delivered it?
The short answer is no. It's to a great extent decoupled from that. The longer answer is if we're looking at the evolution of the atmosphere we're measuring the stuff leaving the atmosphere. We also have to take account of stuff coming in. And what's in the atmosphere today represents the net sum of incoming and outgoing. Most of the incoming, whether it's from stuff hitting the planet and releasing volatiles or from volcanic release, was very early in the history of the planet. And most of the outgoing was subsequent. So we think to a great extent they're separable. But you really have to include both to understand the processes.
On my 2-arrow diagram, I left off all the arrows that point into the atmosphere. Okay. So the last point I'll make is not a measurement, but this is where we're headed with ESCAPE. We know where the knobs are set, and that's really important for being able to extrapolate back in time. Because as you understand how the processes work, and you have measurements at different settings of the knobs, different settings of solar wind pressure, or photons coming from the sun, or how the magnetic field is oriented, you can make different versions of these maps that correspond to each setting, and you can drop them in here. And then you can understand fully how the system responds to all the different drivers. And the longer that we stay at Mars and make measurements, the more fully populated this map becomes. But in 1 Earth year, we should have enough information to make estimates of how each of these different drivers affects things. And that's what allows us to go back in time. So this is why I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about solar storms. Solar storms are basically our windows into the past. And not only do they occur today, but they're representative of conditions that are likely to have been important long ago in Martian history. And I'm not going to go into details of the 3 plots I'm going to show right here, but basically, here's now on the right-hand side someplace, and here's long ago. And this is, I should have labeled it better, I'm sorry. This is a representation of the photons coming from the sun. How bright was the sun shining? And that's energy going into the atmosphere. Long ago, there was more at ultraviolet wavelengths, at extreme ultraviolet wavelengths. The luminosity, total luminosity of the sun actually has gone the other way. Over time, it was fainter. You may have heard of the faint young sun problem. But at extreme ultraviolet wavelengths, it was brighter long ago. More energy for escape. The solar wind, this is an estimate of the solar wind based on observations of other stars like our sun at various times in their lifespan. The solar wind was more robust long ago, stronger. And this is a really old one. It's basically, I think, just analytic calculations, because this is a relatively hard thing to measure. But the magnetic field that's carried by the solar wind should have been stronger long ago. All of the conditions that Mars regularly experiences today are weak compared to what Mars was exposed to a long time ago. And this is why we really wanted to see a solar storm. Okay, very quickly, solar storm and space weather, for me, are catch-all terms that refer to a whole lump of things. And sometimes it refers to flares. This is light coming from the sun, sometimes extreme ultraviolet, sometimes X-rays. Those flares can generate solar energetic particles, SEPs, basically relativistic particles that flow along field lines and hit the planet. At the same time, another type of solar storm or space weather, and this is more commonly referred to as a solar storm than flares are, is a CME, coronal mass ejection, just a bunch of mass burped out from the solar atmosphere, and it creates a big magnetic disturbance, and that magnetic disturbance grows and propagates outward into the heliosphere and also encounters the planet. As it's propagating out, there's a shock, basically a point at which the plasma goes, oh my goodness, this thing is coming by, I better act all excited. As that shock propagates out, it generates solar energetic particles as well that can race ahead of the shock. So if one of these is about to hit your planet, you're very likely to see solar energetic particles before the shock comes through. but not always. Every one of these events is different, and it depends upon whether you're hit square on or on the side or on the trailing side as to what happens. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It turns out in March we had a fair amount of activity consisting of several flares and also several coronal mass ejections. So again, like a previous diagram, the sun is at the center and Earth is over here. And this is a model calculation, the n-little model. But the model calculation is driven by actual observations of the sun. So all sorts of observations feed into the model, and then the model predicts what's happening all throughout the inner solar system. Earth is over here, here's Venus, and here's Mars, relative to Earth, because Earth is always fixed on this line. That's why Mars is going the wrong way. And then here are the stereo spacecraft, the twin stereo spacecraft over here, and Mercury. So this is the velocity in the solar wind, and you can see all these things burped out from the sun, sometimes hitting the stereo spacecraft, sometimes really walloping into Venus, and then almost all of them hit Mars, at least on the flanks, according to this model. And then some of them hit Earth as well. And this was all in early March. And so we measured this event, and Bruce showed you those observations. But this sort of puts into context, at least from the model perspective, what we should have seen. So now, this is just the whole story I've been talking about for an hour in about 3 slides. We measured the drivers, all 4 of them. The light coming from the sun, including different flare events. The solar energetic, boy, this all got shifted, my labels got shifted. The solar energetic particles, in this case solar energetic electrons, but we also measure solar energetic ions, and all the high energy particles hit you first, because the high energetic, the shock creates solar energetic particles. Some are high energy, some are low energy. They all race away from the shock. The high energy ones hit you first because they're going faster. So you see the high energy ones first and then the low energy ones.
As opposed to the ones that are coming directly out of the flare?
Correct. Yeah, so the CME, this shows that the CME did encounter Mars, so we should have seen SEPs from the CME. Boy, that's alphabet soup. We should have seen energetic particles from the storm thingy. Okay. So high energetic particles, a big injection as the shock itself comes through, and then continued energetic particles afterward. We also measured the more quiet solar wind itself, the non-relativistic particles, and you can see things get brighter and they move more to the top of the diagram. They have more energy as the shock comes through the system. This beating, this sort of repetitive pattern you see is because MAVEN is orbiting Mars. And so you're sampling different regions of that near Mars space, passing through the boundary that shall not be named, passing close to the planet far away. And so you measure different things at different times, but in this long time baseline diagram, you can see a lot of energy being deposited in the solar wind and from solar energetic particles, but you can see flares happening as well. And you can see the magnetic field carried by the solar wind. You can see the orbital cadence here, and then a big amplitude, a big elevation of the magnetic field where it doesn't even hardly get down to a few nanotesla, and then quiets back down again. So this is a very interesting event to study because a lot of things are going on. The whole team was excited and in a tizzy for several weeks after it happened, and our weekly phone call was dominated by this, I'd say, for 3 or 4 weeks as people kept contributing pieces of the puzzle. So it was exciting to see this play out in real time. And then the last 2 diagrams are the response, and Bruce already talked about this, and I need to take a drink. But I'll just point out a couple things that he showed as well. When we were close to the planet, when the altitude was low, the magnetic field gets larger as the spaghetti noodles sort of bunch up against the cotton candy. But also the crustal magnetic fields, there were some weak crustal magnetic fields at low altitudes there before the shock came through, before the storm came through. And I'm going to focus here on 2 diagrams. And these are plasma spectrograms, and they're really cool. Time goes this way. In this diagram, it's the energy of ions measured by our static instrument. So at any given time, this is how many low energy ions, how many middle energy, how many high energy ions. You can see we're out in the solar wind. And when we get close to the planet, we're measuring low energy ions that haven't been accelerated away from the planet quite so much yet. Then the energies go up again and we get back out into the solar wind. In this spectrogram, instead of looking at energy in this direction, we're looking at the mass of the particles that we measure. So low mass, mass of 1 atomic mass unit, that's hydrogen. This is helium right here. So we're definitely measuring the solar wind, which is 96% hydrogen, 4% helium. We're measuring that. When we get close to the planet, high mass ions is what we're seeing, still before the storm comes through. We're seeing O+ and O2+ and a soup of CO2+ and other stuff. We're measuring atmospheric particles that still have relatively low energies, haven't been fully accelerated away from the planet yet. Then we go into the tail region behind Mars, and every once in a while we see burps of high mass ions. These are particles that have been accelerated away from the planet and are now down here waving goodbye, and MAVEN happened to catch them as it was leaving. So it's fun to look at a diagram like this and say, I see planetary ions, I can tell what energy they are. And these planetary ions right here are being measured at the same time as solar wind type stuff. And let's look up here. This is the solar wind, and look, here's this high energy stuff right above it. That must be the planetary ions that have a little extra energy. And so even with sort of eye-glazing diagrams like this, you can understand a lot about how the system responds. It's really fun. Oh yeah, good. I should have just thrown that up. Okay. Then after it came through, the big thing to notice is everything got redder. There's just more of everything. After this solar storm came through, more escape, lots more high mass ions. Their energies are a little bit higher even at low altitudes. And then the high mass ions behind the planet, we're seeing many more of them. And it's relatively exciting to see how the system has responded to this solar storm coming through.
How do you distinguish escaping hydrogen from Mars versus the protons that are in the solar wind?
Yeah, it can be challenging. I mean, protons are not wearing name tags that say I came from the sun versus I came from the planet. So sometimes it's context. Sometimes you know what the energy of the solar, for example, there's a great example right here. Wait, is it labeled? No. Here's a great example right here. Here's solar wind out here. This is pretty unambiguous given where we are located with respect to the planet. And the solar wind here has a certain energy. Down here, we're seeing stuff with the same energy in a place where we're seeing high mass ions, but also some low mass ions as well. It turns out the low mass ions, when you really delve into the observation, it's the low mass ions that are here. These are protons really close to the planet. You might be tempted to say that those protons are from the planet itself. The planet has hydrogen in the atmosphere, at least a little bit. But the fact that it has this really high energy is really disturbing. All the other planetary particles have low energies that are off the map in this one, and you can see them down here. The fact that there's such high energy is really puzzling for the protons, and it's really telling that it has the same energy as the solar wind.
Are they precipitating into the atmosphere from the solar wind?
It's double charge exchange, so let me explain what that means. And we see this orbit after orbit after orbit, but it's especially intense during the solar storm. So the solar wind is going towards the planet, and it should get deflected around the planet, and the solar wind protons shouldn't get down to those altitudes. But one way for them to get down to those altitudes is for a really rare occurrence. Most of the particles are diverted around, but say one had a little collision. And when it had a collision, it became a neutral particle. So then it's just going to move in a straight line, and it's going to move down to low altitudes towards the planet. That's great, that can happen, but our ion instrument is never going to measure that particle again because now it's neutral. So an even rarer occurrence, maybe actually a more common occurrence given that you're getting down into a higher density region, is for that particle to collide a second time and become ionized again. And then when it becomes ionized, our instrument can measure it again. So what you're seeing is solar wind coming towards the planet. Some of it gets neutralized and we don't see it. And then as it becomes ionized again, we start to see it again. And so one of our team members, Jasper Hallekas, is studying this phenomenon. It's pretty cool. All right. MAVEN, which is not actually that color, but this is neat, is doing, yes, is doing,
It's actually pretty close to that color.
I thought the blankets were not silver. Was that?
They're like a dull gray.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so it might be that color, but this is a little shinier, something like that. Okay. Anyway, MAVEN is pretty, and it's making really cool observations, and I'm glad I waited around a decade for them to start coming in, because it's really fun. The end. So here's the last thing. What does this mean? I mean, this means we're going to learn about the Martian atmosphere. It means we're going to learn about those up arrows. It means we're going to try to figure out, and we're going to be successful in figuring out how much atmosphere is escaping today and how much has escaped through time. We're going to be able to learn about the past climate of Mars and maybe provide insight when, oh, that's a pun, maybe provide clues when coupled with other measurements from other parts of the Mars community about early habitability on the planet. And so I really love studying Mars. I'm really lucky to study Mars. The planet is totally beautiful. But Mars is, in my view, and I'm not sure if everyone shares that view, in my view, MAVEN is not just a Mars mission, it's a planetary mission. It teaches us about how atmospheres work everywhere, not just at Mars. When you're studying the processes that should happen everywhere, you end up learning about how planets should behave everywhere. And as you know, we're now detecting planets everywhere that we look, and there are lots of them. And we've gone from having 0 examples to having more examples than we could count in a human lifetime, and not really knowing which planet outside of our solar system to pick to start looking at and investigating. So any little lever you can get to try and understand which planets are interesting and which planets are less interesting from a habitability standpoint helps. And so MAVEN may contribute, admittedly in a incremental small way, but every contribution helps. MAVEN helps us understand how atmospheres work. MAVEN also helps us understand how our own atmosphere can work. I mean, we're a magnetized planet. Mars is unmagnetized, but a lot of the same processes occur in both places, and that comparison can be particularly informative at times. And then overall, it can tell us the type of things that MAVEN measures and that other spacecraft measure and investigate can tell us whether Mars has always looked like this, or maybe whether someday, a long time ago, Mars looked more like that. I'm fine with either answer as a scientist, but I would like to have an answer as a scientist. And so using whatever data and measurements are available, it's really fun to think about questions like that. Okay, thanks.
There was a paper that came out either yesterday or the day before modeling warm, wet versus all ice. Can MAVEN add data at all to the, it was previously primarily liquid versus ice, even though it would be the same content?
Is this the Robin Wordsworth paper? Yeah. You want to go, or you want me to go?
No, I want to hear your answer.
MAVEN can tell us how big those arrows should have been drawn on the diagram. It can tell us how much atmosphere was removed away to space. And that goes into understanding past climate. And so the details of understanding, I mean, from my perspective, details of understanding what role ice played and things like that has to fit into the context of the measurements, has to fit into the context of how much atmosphere was there in the first place.
So I'm guessing Paul's going to go into this some tomorrow, but I get that if you have a solar energetic event now, with lots of SEPs and lots of CMEs and lots of magnetic field shock run, that mimics how the sun might have been at an earlier epoch on a more normal case. The part I'm missing is you only have a thin atmosphere now. You don't have a thick atmosphere from the past. You don't know whether that enhanced EUV created a much stronger ionosphere. And what I'm wondering is, how do you extrapolate back in time to make statements like, we'll know how Mars lost its atmosphere, when there's that component missing of, you can't measure a Mars with a thick atmosphere today.
So
Is that clear?
Yes, that's very clear, and it's been a topic of conversation within our team. And when we were proposing the mission, we had to have this discussion and come up with strategies. And so, to paraphrase what you're saying, MAVEN is measuring the external inputs to the system, but MAVEN, by the fact that time moves forward, can't know what the lower boundary condition was like, can't know what the atmosphere was like. And so there are two strategies, or probably more than that. One strategy is to use the measurements that we have to validate models. And when we validate the models, we gain confidence that those models can work in other regimes. And then we can rely more heavily on the models to help us extrapolate back in time, not just use the observations. The second one, as you alluded to in the very first part of your question, is that we're going to have the isotope ratios. And any answer that we come up with by extrapolating back in time from measurements and models better agree with the anchor points that Paul's instrument will provide to us, and that Paul and Bruce, the information that Paul and Bruce are going to provide. So this provides an anchor, an independent verification of what we can do with the extrapolation.
So is Paul as excited about isotope ratios as you are about plasma?
Yes, you should see his dance moves. Oh.
Jump was high.
Yeah, you should see his dance moves. They're pretty impressive. Okay.
Okay, I have to ask, did you all dance your dissertations?
That was just starting when I was defending, and I'm glad that I missed it. Yeah.
Dave is well known for his dancing colloquia and seminars.
And that doesn't mean I'm trying to evade questions and things like that.
And he does radio interviews in mime, too.
Okay. Anything else? Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
So I'm afraid that I'm going to make you repeat some points you made earlier.
Yeah, that's great.
Could we look again at the net escaping flux method and the Mohawk picture?
Which one first?
Let's look at the net escaping flux first.
Oh, they're right next to each other, so that's easy. Okay.
So, and can you tell me again the story of how you get from this guy to the Mohawk?
Sure. Can I do it in the other order?
Yes.
Okay. So here, in this Mohawk, the colored lines are particle trajectories of charged particles leaving the planet, accelerated by electric fields that have low or moderate energies at low altitudes, but the longer they're exposed to the electric field, the more energy they gain. And the orientation of that electric field says which direction they should go. And here, the particles are leaving the planet. They're all going upward. Here, behind the planet, they're all leaving the planet. They're going that way. But in this model calculation, this black yucky stuff right here are particles that failed to leave. They were carried some way and then they went back down. And so here you can see in this model diagram, there's escape, but there's also return. There are particles that are moving back towards the planet. And so this model was published, and our team member is saying, there's a polar plume, or it should work like this. Please give us the measurements. And so one thing you can do is you can draw a shell around the planet, and you can see where things are going up, where things are going down. There's a lot more I can do that will be happening in the coming months, so I'll talk about that at the very end. So now, on the day side, a lot of stuff is going down at these low latitudes. Low latitudes are in here. So black here corresponds to red on my map. Color here corresponds to blue on my map, because I wanted to make it as easy as possible for you. Okay, so there's some hint up here that there's stuff leaving. But Dave is going to talk about this much more, because his evidence, the evidence that he'll present, I think, is a lot more effective way to make the case at the moment. Behind the planet, blue, stuff leaving the planet, corresponds to all this colored stuff here. So now we'll go into what can happen next. High energy stuff, lower energy stuff. In my maps, I can separate by energy. I haven't done it yet, but I can make a map for low energy stuff and a map for high energy stuff and compare to the model. I can make maps for O plus versus O2 plus versus CO2 plus. I can divide that out and look at different species as they're escaping. This was only O plus, I believe, in this model calculation, but I can look at the different chemical species. I can make maps for different solar wind pressures, different EUV fluxes, different IMF. I have a lot of work to do. But it's kind of easy. It's just butterfly net. You know, I'm just catching ions. So separating it out is going to be the fun part, and that's what's going to allow us to extrapolate. Did I answer your question? Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, when will you be doing all of that, extrapolating that?
Oh, over the next few months.
Okay.
So right now, it's not that productive to do it until these last few effects are corrected for in the data, especially at low energies. The low energies, you know, we want to make sure we're getting those right and that we're not actually measuring how the spacecraft itself has accelerated particles. And so we want to make sure that that's robustly corrected, and then this will fall out. And then the more measurements we get, the more we can fill in these maps. The more these maps are oversampled, you know, the more we have 200 measurements in a bin as opposed to 20 measurements in a bin, the more reliably we're going to be able to separate into maps and compare directly back and forth. Yeah. Yes.
Hey, Plasma Dance Guy.
Yeah.
I'm imagining a planet with a predominantly CO2 atmosphere, no global magnetic field.
Venus.
Yeah. Has the polar escape been observed at Venus?
So
Should it be?
it should be at Venus. Venus Express just ended. And the same people who had the instrument on Mars Express made the instrument for Venus Express, and they had the added bonus of having the magnetic field. So Mars Express itself, part of the reason it hasn't reported the polar plume is because it wasn't able to organize its data according to those electric fields. So even if it could measure it, it couldn't really report the polar plume. It turns out Mars Express, the field of view of the instrument itself, was also not ideally situated in the correct locations, so that even if they had the magnetic field, they probably wouldn't have seen the polar plume very often. As far as I know, I'm hedging here. I'm giving a long preamble because I'm going to hedge. As far as I know, there hasn't been a strong report of polar plume from Venus Express either. And it could be for the same field of view type reason, that they're oriented improperly, or it could just be that it hasn't been pulled out of the data yet for them.
But in principle, the same process should
Correct.
or could work there.
Correct. There's one other issue here, too, with Mars Express. Mars Express is great, and Venus Express is great, but their ION instrument has a cadence of 192 seconds. And it spends 12 seconds looking this way, and then 12 here, and then 12 here, and 12 here. The low cadence of the measurements also means you can fly through that plume and miss it entirely.
Don't forget, there's also the possibility that Venus doesn't have a polar plume for reasons we don't yet understand.
Sure.
Just because we think it might be the same processes operating in a similar environment doesn't mean that it is.
True.
That's why we went to the rather than just extrapolating from Venus, from minor Venus.
And one issue, I mean, you expect the same processes to occur to zeroth order, but one big difference between Venus and Mars is size of the planet relative to the size of these trajectories. The size of the trajectories is set by the strength of the magnetic field, how fast things are flowing. So relative to the planet, even if Venus had a polar plume, you expect it to be a lot more compact compared to the size of the planet. So it certainly wouldn't look like this if you had to draw it at Venus.
And just as an added comment, the way it's drawn here, it really does look like a mohawk haircut. But when I look at the distribution on your map, it really reminds me of Tintin.
I expect you to show up at the next team meeting looking like one of those two things.
I've already had a mohawk.
Okay. And I also say I'm not doing it.
No pictures exist, fortunately.
Well, that's what you think.
I didn't know.
That I know of.
Guys in Caltech archives now.
Okay, any other questions? Because I think we're right at the end of my time. Okay, thank you.